Catalonia. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this session, in which, under the title of Europe's Digital Challenge, a dialogue with experts from Catalonia and the European Union, we will analyze a topic that in this very moment, and not only in the European Union, but as a whole in the world, has become of greater prominence, and I will add even much prominent in the post-pandemic stage. Without further delay, I give the floor to the person who will moderate this event, Jacques Parrot. Welcome, and go ahead, Jacques.
Thank you so much, Gorka, and welcome everybody who's joining us on this live stream. We are, as Gorka says, we are going to have an in-depth discussion, but also taking sort of into account the need for the EU's digital challenges to really be implemented and understandable for the general public. It's such a big issue now. Huge amounts of money, for instance, from the EU's recovery fund are all earmarked for digital transitions. And obviously, we know that our lives are becoming ever more digital. So we have a group of people who are going to thrash all of these different aspects out. We're going to talk about AI. We're going to be talking about the EU's own sort of autonomous nature, how to make sure that the digital challenges that Europe faces are ones that it can look after itself on. And we're going to talk about governance. We've got a ton of different issues. We'll try and break down some of the policies that are going through in the European Union at the moment as well. So I'll introduce myself. My name's Jacques Parrot. I'm a Brussels-based correspondent, presenter, and event moderator, and I'm delighted to be guiding you through today and to have this discussion with everybody that's joining. Without further ado, though, I'm going to hand over to Maria Galindo. She's the Director General of the Digital Nation and Urban Agenda in the government of Catalonia. And she's going to give us some introductory thoughts, some introductory comments from the government of Catalonia's point of view. So we're delighted to have you with us, Maria, and I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thanks, Gorka, and thanks, Daniel, to the delegation of the government in Brussels, and to the Center for Contemporary Studies for having this session, which I think is going to be amazing with these participants. I'd like to introduce you to what we're doing in Catalonia. We like to call ourselves Catalonia, the land of digital revolutionaries, because we are not just, the European Union is doing a lot of things in order to advance digitally as Europe. And with the new EU, with the new programming period for 2021 and 2027 with Digital Europe and the strategies that the European Union is pushing forward in areas like blockchain, AI, data, cybersecurity, plus the importance that the Commission is giving to the recovery funds in terms of digitalization, which needs to be as something, or the Commission thinks that it should be something transversal in everything that we do. And in Catalonia, we couldn't be more aligned with these European strategies. Back in 2018, the government of Catalonia named for the first time the Ministry for Digital Policies. And now this year, 2021, this has been upgraded. We had an upgrade of the Ministry of Digital Policy to the Vice Presidency of the government and Ministry for Digital Policy and Development. So little by little, Catalonia is actually devoting a greater importance to our digital policies. We have three main objectives as government for the digital policies. The first one is to digitize everything that we do. And so we've seen with the pandemic that the adoption of digital has accelerated. We are now we're doing this session remotely through digital tools, but we also do digital for education, for healthcare. So digitalization is a big opportunity for Europe. we need to continue to bet for digitalization, but we have a huge challenge ahead. One is how we transform our society into a digital society of empowered citizens. And so one of the objectives of our government is to really empower citizens while also advocating for the fundamental rights, which also need to be digital rights, and also promoting the Catalan language online, because this is an issue that we must continue to access platforms and everything that is online in Catalan. So second of our objectives is to connect our territory, not just in terms of infrastructures like mobility and like transport connectivity, but also in terms of digital connectivity. We've seen that wherever in Catalonia, wherever we bring the fiberglass, it's actually a way of really balancing the territory, because you know, when connectivity arrives to a territory, then more companies can go there to be implemented there, and also this creates a lot of jobs. And you know that the creation of jobs, it's what makes a territory to be more sustainable, or also in terms of society sustainability. So third of these objectives is to bring on the digital economy. So bringing on the digital economy and also digitalizing the economy. And this in terms of talent, innovation, circularity, and also, for instance, home office. We've seen that by working remotely, we can also attract talent, not just local talent, but international talent. So we need to also bring these new capacities to our companies in order to be more competitive. A fourth objective is cybersecurity. Since we are advocating for a digital society, we need more and more to be able to bring this trustful and interoperability of data and of everything that we do into all our companies, but also the government, how we talk to our citizens, how we communicate with the citizens and with companies. So we need to advocate for a super cyber secure country. And fifth, and not less important, is we are as government super involved also in the fight for climate change. So we need to move into a decarbonized, connected, collective and shared mobility. And this also through technology will be made possible. So I want to thank you again for holding these debates and for making this happen, because it's a good thing that we can exchange ideas and knowledge and debate and also share concerns. In Barcelona, we're now holding the Smart City Expo these days. Today was the inauguration, and I was now having lunch with a delegation from the Flanders government, from the Flemish government. So we were also sharing our doubts and concerns about how to really deploy all these digital tools that we can to make our society more digital, to make our economy more digital, and to also transit to a more digital Europe. So thank you so much, moltes gracias, and enjoy the debate.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your opening comments. We really appreciate you joining us. And as you say, there are so many angles, these sort of priorities that governments are having to look at. And there is no choice actually for governments. You have to be finding a way to do this and to progress the change that needs to happen. So for everybody who's joining us and watching us through the YouTube feed, you can put your questions as comments into the feed as we go forward through this event. And our speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, you can tell me the questions and I will put those questions to the speakers as we go through. We've got a lot of different angles we're going to look at. And so if there's anything, if you're watching, you don't particularly understand or you want more information on, then just drop a quick comment into that chat, and we will make sure we put it to the panelists. If you are talking about our event, if you are joining the discussions on Twitter, we are using the hashtag EU Digital Challenge. So hashtag EU Digital Challenge. You can find, if you head to the Catalan Government, handle as well, Catalonia_EU, you'll be able to find the handles of the people that are talking as well. So you can tag in and you can join the conversation there. So that's the sort of structure. We're going to have a few outlining speeches from our panelists, and then we're going to move into a sort of debate about the issues that they've brought up. A lot of the people that are joining are real experts in their area. I'll introduce all four of them to start with, and then we will hear from each of them in turn. The first of our speakers is Luin Schmidt. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute Barcelona d'Estudios Internacionals, where he focuses on the EU's global role in artificial intelligence, and he's a former policy analyst at the European Policy Strategy Center. We also have Andrea G. Rodriguez, who is a researcher at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. She focuses on emerging technologies, and she's also a member of the program committee of the European Cybersecurity Forum, CyberSec, and is a lead researcher at the Global Observatory of Urban Artificial Intelligence. We also have Andreas Aktudianakis, who is an EU digital policy analyst at the European Policy Center here in Brussels, and a former special advisor to the director of the Open Society European Policy Institute. And last but not least, we have Martina Ancini, who is an EU digital market expert at the European Institute of Public Administration and a former legal policy analyst at the Centrum für Europäische Politik in Freiburg. So they are our four speakers. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. So I'm going to hand the floor first to Luin, who is joining us from Barcelona. Really great to have you with us. So you look into artificial intelligence, and I think we've seen, obviously, it's been a lot in the news recently. We're looking forward to hearing your brief presentation.
Thank you. Buona tarda, good afternoon to everyone. As someone who lives in Brussels and works in Brussels, I can only attest to what Ms. Galindo said in her opening remarks. I think Barcelona is really a city that's well positioned to be one of these startup hubs in Europe and globally. But before going into sort of the Catalan and Barcelona peculiarities, I want to say a few quick words about the state of the European tech ecosystem more generally, as it's the topic of today's discussion. And looking back at my time at the Commission at the end of the Juncker mandate, some of the key indicators that we were concerned with, when I look at those now, I think Europe has done a good job in pushing its tech system in terms of number of startups, venture capital. There's been very good developments, and that's good to see. But I also came across one headline figure in my research that I thought was so shocking that I really wanted to bring it up today in the discussion. It's a topic that I think does not get enough attention when we talk about digital policy. And that's the fact that of venture capital in the last year, more than 90% went to startups that were all male in their teams. More than 90%. That means that almost no money went to startups that had even one woman or two women in their board. And I think this gender discrepancy is really a missed opportunity for Europe because there's a lot of good ideas. And it's also, in terms of gender equality, obviously a very critical point. So I think that's something we should look into more in detail. Why is that? How can we fix it? How can we really make use of the full potential of the European population? Now, turning to AI more specifically, because indeed that's my research topic, there's a few things I'd like to quickly mention. And the first one is, last week there was the GPay forum in Paris. That's sort of the global forum to regulate and talk about AI policy. And I thought it was, as an observer, I thought it was very interesting to see that the European Commission really was almost front and center amongst all the big nations. And I think that's quite an achievement in terms of the EU's ambition to position itself as a global player when it comes to AI regulation. The fact that they were sitting on these panels, that people were referencing the AI regulation, etc., really shows how much it has achieved. But of course, the AI Act is still in negotiations in Brussels, and looking at the different positions between the Parliament and the member states, I also see big gaps, and I'm curious as to how that will develop. Lastly, and I won't stop there, but something that I wanted to bring up, because I'm just working on this research with a colleague, is the issue of killer robots or lethal autonomous weapon systems, that when people talk about AI, they don't put enough attention on that. And I think the European Commission very clearly even completely discarded the topic of killer robots or military applications from its AI Act. And that's something that we should also grasp with. Why is that? How can we make sure that the EU also has something to say on the topic of killer robots? So that's some input from my side. I'm looking forward to seeing what the other experts have to say. Back to you, Jack.
Thank you so much, Lewin. So, I mean, this is the big topic, and it's certainly a huge issue, this AI Act here in Brussels. I've had lots of conversations with people. Essentially, for our viewers, if you're not aware of how it really works, it's a structured proposal where certain elements and uses of AI are totally outlawed, and there's a sort of pyramid scheme down to ones that are sort of everyday and allowed and don't seem to be a threat. But there are quite a lot of people who think that the structure isn't necessarily safeguarded enough yet, and so I'm sure we're going to talk about that more with some of the other experts as well. So thank you so much, Lewin, for your opening comments. So now we're going to turn to Andrea G. Rodriguez. So Andrea, how are you doing? Thanks so much for joining us on our event today. We look forward to your opening comments. I think I can't see you, but I hope you're with us. Yeah, there you
are. I am. I was trying to turn it on, but I just couldn't. I'm sorry for these 3 seconds of mischief. And so thank you very much for the invitation. And I have to say thank you for 2 reasons. The first one, on a personal basis, I'm very grateful to be included in this panel and to see amazing colleagues such as Lewin, whom I think I've met a couple of times at CEDAW, and of course to hear more about the Catalonian strategy for digital transformation. And of course, I have to say thank you in regards to from CEDAW, because we're always following these debates, and being part of one of them is certainly something that recognizes our work. So thank you very much for the invitation. As for my opening remarks, I want to build on Lewin, because I think he opened up a very interesting topic, which is the AI Act, but I don't want to miss out on seeing many other developments that are right now on the floor. So in December 2020, the Commission unveiled the proposals for the DSA and DMA, Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, which are aimed to control the power of platforms in two ways. The first one, which is more on DSA on that level, would be the spread of disinformation, which is certainly one of the key topics that the Commission has been looking at. And there is a component there on AI, which is of course trying to open up the algorithms and rule the platforms for researchers like me that may want in the future to look at the different components or the weights that the algorithm takes in order to project certain certain advertisements to a specific person, but also for journalists and independent researchers in order to ensure that the platform does not discriminate or does not improperly, let's say, disregard or target a group of people. And the DMA, Digital Markets Act, that also wants to control the way the platforms operate in terms of like opening up the market for new companies to profit from that. And I think that this is a very interesting comment, because when we speak about digital in the European Union, we normally speak about the digital in terms of like digital single market, because let's not forget that the European Union, it's a, let's say, it's a common market and it's not a political union yet. So that means that all the policies are aimed at boosting the competitiveness of the European economy, and I think that should be read on that sense. So with that glance, looking at the DMA, that's a very innovative policy, because that will help startups, for example, to enter the market, in a market that is already monopolized to some extent, monopolized by a few companies, right? So when we speak, for example, of search we would think about Google immediately. When we think, for example, of delivery, we would look at Amazon. And if we're speaking about the cloud, we would see a couple of them coming into the market, such as like Microsoft Azure. We also have Amazon Web Services. We also have Google Play in it, so on and so forth. So I think these two should be also brought to the table. Now, connecting with the AI Act, I think that those things are really interesting to look into, but also connecting to the AI Act. The AI Act is a very innovative policy, as Lewin said, because it assesses and it brings consensus on a topic that is largely lacking consensus. So from CEDAW, we opened up an observatory of urban artificial intelligence back in July, and we are looking at different issues. And one of the first outcomes we just revealed, that we just published, is the lack of consensus on AI policy. So we mapped up to 20 different documents from public sector, private sector, academia, think tanks, and we tried to disguise what are those things, what are those principles that these policies were looking into. And we found out in 20 documents different, like 19 different principles. So I think that having one single document assessing the risks and based on certain principles is a very interesting piece. And I'm very looking forward to seeing how it implements. But also from a cybersecurity perspective, which is probably my other leg, we are right now trying to review the NIST directive. The NIST directive is what has been coordinating the efforts in cybersecurity and promoting cyber resilience in the Union. And that obviously needed an update. Why? Because the spectrum of information system has been growing. We have the Internet of Things coming up. We have also the space, right, which is something that is not normally considered as something that should be brought into the policies. And NIST 2 tries to look at these things and update the framework that has been so successful in coordinating the response to cyber attacks, which are obviously not, they have this escalating effect. You can target one thing happening in one member state, and then it can just like keep spilling over to affect many others. So I don't want to like have most of the times brought, but I think that these two different angles of the European digital policy, which is the cybersecurity angle and the AI angle, complement each other, because you cannot build AI that is competitive on the market, again, bringing in the market perspective, if it's not robust and if it's not cybersecure, and if you don't have a secure like digital realm.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Is that, yeah, that's it. You're finishing. Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, you've brought so much to talk about there. I think I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and the DMA a little bit later, to perhaps try and thrash out what they're going to mean in practice for us people that use our phones and buy things on the internet, because that's really what they're about, is trying to sort of level out the playing field of all of those issues. So thank you so much, Andrea, for your opening comments. We're now going to turn to Andreas from the EPC. I hope he's able to bring his video up and we can speak to him. Yeah. So Andreas I think you're in Brussels. I know you're Brussels based. You're in Brussels now, and we look forward to your opening comments. Andreas, hey.
Hi, Jack. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting us over to this debate today among experts. It's a great topic to discuss and to see previous colleagues here, and happy to parse takeaways from our work. So when you look at the challenges that the EU will be facing on digital, you're looking, I think, at a very, very large picture, and it's very hard sometimes to say where we are on this picture. And just without wanting to repeat some of the things that Lewin and Andrea have already said, I think it's very useful to situate all these within this narrative that we talk about in Brussels, what we call EU strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty, to make it more focused on the digital side. And I think this is really important, because what we are experiencing today in the EU is a crisis where we don't want to be third players in a race for digitalization. And third place, that would be coming after the US and China. Obviously, here the issue of values is extremely important, and the EU has a very clear set of values that it separates itself from other authoritarian or techno-authoritarian states. And Lewin touched upon that, and I believe Andrea too, by referring to the DSA and DMA, and also the importance of having a good representation, good gender balance in all these fast developing sectors. But when it comes to digital sovereignty and the EU, I think it's important to note how have some things changed. So in the past, we used to refer to our relationship with the US in the framework of cooperation. When things changed dramatically with the election of Donald Trump in the White House, around that time, the EU was going through the Brexit discussions and the Brexit referendum, right? So it had become clear what can digital mean for politics. And at the same time, the EU felt that all that they were discussing previously in the framework of cooperation now seemed like a dependency. And this is where EU digital sovereignty comes in, because with 92% of the EU's data stored outside the EU in cloud storages such as by Microsoft or Amazon or others, and with other digital monopolies that we see on on digital markets, right? With all these things, and together with the questions about how to make sure that online content is safe and is not illegal, but also not harmful. With all these, it's really important that the EU has its own approach to regulation and its own approach to building the infrastructure that will be supporting this digitalization that we're talking about. So yes, AI, of course, and Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act are key. But I think what is key here is to think about how can we bring these proposals in line with the EU's bigger plans in this G2 world that it is afraid it could be locked in. So it's important to think about how can we export these regulations and have these regulations also been mirrored to a certain extent in our working relationship with the US in the Trade and Technology Council. So I think this will be the $1 million challenge for us and for the EU coming ahead. And of course, other more detailed discussions on cybersecurity, semiconductors, standard setting, we can have in a bit. But for now, I'll just stop and leave it here. Thank you.
You've dropped a bomb on us there as well with G2, Andreas. That's a terrifying concept, isn't it? It's not the first time I've heard it mentioned in this context of digital issues, and that it is going to be a huge issue to confront as the EU moves forward, especially with these policies. Okay, so thank you so much, Andreas. We really appreciate your opening comments. You've also left us a ton of things that we're going to have to pick up on later, but we will next hear from Martina Ancini, who is joining us, I hope. Yeah, there we go. So Martina, lovely to have you with us. Thanks for joining us, and I'll just leave you the floor to outline your thoughts.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank to those who are listening to us for their attention. And I hope that there will be comments and questions at the end of our respective presentations. So I would just like to provide my own contribution to the discussion by highlighting that while the big tech industry is always at the center of the discussion of the digitalization of the economy, as we have as we can observe from the presentations that have just been delivered, which have talked a lot about the DSA, Digital Services Act proposal, the Digital Markets Act proposal, digital sovereignty. According to the data strategy of the Commission, there is a technology that could be a game changer in this respect, which is the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is an infrastructure that connects physical objects between each other and to the internet. and which creates a sort of smart environment. So it's objects which provide data as to how they are used, as to how often they are used, and as to their own functioning. So this could be a game changer from the point of view of the Commission. Why so? Well, because data is produced and collected outside of platforms. It is produced by such smart objects and stored by such smart objects. And the other important element is that data is under the firm control of the undertaking that produces such data. So there is a sort of firm control of the undertaking over its own data, and this is not the case in the use of other technologies for which the undertakings might be forced to use data centers. And so its data could be stored somewhere else, and it could fear that the most sensitive data that lies in the data center could be accessed by, for example, foreign authorities, if it is a foreign player which administers the data center. So the Internet of Things could be a game changer, but this could only be a theoretical possibility. Why do I say so? Well, first, in order to produce good quality outputs in the digital economy, you need a lot of data. So such data producers which obtain data from smart objects might be forced to share data or to pool data with other market players in order to use such data meaningfully. And here comes a first problem, in the sense that data producing undertakings today hesitate to pool and share data because they fear that they might lose control over their own data. There is no, let's say, clear regime applicable to rights over data or prerogatives on data. So in the moment when the undertakings share data, they are unsure as to whether the other, let's say, undertakings will comply, will, let's say, observe the restrictions, the contractual restrictions on the data, or whether a third party could illegitimately access their data. So this is the main fear, and this is the fear that the Commission is trying to tackle by elaborating a proposal which has not been adopted yet, which is called the Data Act. And another problem which might limit, let's say, the effects of the Internet of Things for the digital economy is that pooled and shared data need to be stored somewhere. And this is where the big techs become relevant again, because the cloud sector is a sector which is dominated by few undertakings. And so once again, the undertakings will rely on the services of the big techs with all the problems which follow. And this is, let's say, my initial contribution to the discussion. I hope that there will be comments, and I hope that there will be an exchange on the topics that I addressed, as well as on the topics that that my colleagues addressed. Andreas touched upon a very hot issue, digital sovereignty, and I'm sure that this has raised the curiosity of those who are attending.
Thank you. So much, Martina. We really appreciate your opening comments. So I'm going to ask all of our panelists to put their cameras back on now. And I think probably we'll try and continue this debate in a sort of thematic way. I think the first thing we'll talk about AI to start with. Obviously, that's something that has been mentioned broadly in most of the opening comments. Then I think we'll talk about data and the issues surrounding data. which I think will then lead on to the idea of Europe's sovereignty that Andreas brought up and you just touched on there, Martina. And then we'll look at some of the other perhaps broader issues that are facing people at the moment. Perhaps also we'll talk a bit about connectivity. That's something that Maria mentioned in our beginning talk, but we didn't really talk too much about that because there are still huge holes in connectivity for people as we move through the transition. So let's start with AI though. Perhaps we'll come back to you, Lewin. I wonder if you think that the European Union is going to be able to get this AI Act right. We saw things, for instance, like the GDPR, which is the data protection regulation, that has been kind of a world leader now in online data protection. Is the AI Act going to be successful? Can the EU get this over the line? And what might stop that from happening?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question for everyone working on AI policy these days. I do certainly see a lot of potential. And I think, as I said in my opening remarks, already the European Commission is acknowledged globally as one of the shaping actors of AI policy. So just the mere fact that they are early adopters, they were one of the first ones to put forward such a proposal. Even the US is now looking at the European proposal to get inspired about the risk-based approach. So to say, as you explained, there's high-risk applications that need to be regulated more strictly, then there's lower-risk applications where we can have more free innovation without so many strings attached. I think even that philosophy, that's already getting picked up globally, and that shows that the EU has a lot of potential. But indeed, it's sort of in the blue whether this proposal will actually be passed in time, how it will look like in the end, because there are, as I mentioned, many conflicting views. And there I am a bit skeptical whether the final outcome will be ideal for, let's say, the European AI ecosystem. Probably there will be some sort of trade-offs and compromises that may not represent the ideal scenario, but just sort of a mix of different interests.
Yeah. I think there's quite a lot of divisions, and there's also a lot of governments that aren't necessarily, they're sort of leaving it to, I don't know, there's going to be a lot of fights. Andrea, bringing you in on this, the reality, Facebook literally just changed its name to Meta to, become this metaverse where we're all going to sort of virtually meet in some sort of, world that is digital, etc. What do you fear, or what do you think citizens, do you think, these kind of big companies are going to push us into this land of AI, augmented reality, virtual reality, before we have got these laws in place? Do you think that the big tech companies have got more power perhaps than the politicians at the moment?
So I think that the question on the metaverse is a very proper one. I don't really think that we'll see anything looking like a proper metaverse in 5 to 10 years, but the hype is there. And I think that we need to sustain the hype in order to Facebook to have the resources to be able to build it. Because as of now, entering the metaverse will be an extremely expensive endeavor. First of all, because you need the VR glasses, and they're very, very expensive. So not the average consumer will be able to access that. Second, because you don't have probably the expertise to build it as of now. Facebook announced that they would be recruiting 10,000 people only to work in the metaverse here in Europe. So that says already a lot. It's in a very, let's say, initial stage. But
do you reckon people want the metaverse? This is a product that Zuckerberg is like convinced about, right? But is this what we want? Is this what human beings want?
Well, I'm going to be very market oriented here, but normally companies create the necessities that then the society adopts and see as their own necessities in order to sell them products. So if Zuckerberg is convinced that the metaverse is going to be the next thing, even if we're not convinced now, we will be convinced. And it happened already in 2011 or 2010 or 2015 when Apple introduced the smartwatch to the market. None of us were willing to wear a smartwatch. Now, most of the people I know are wearing one. And that leads me to my biggest concern about the metaverse. Is not only about privacy, which is certainly one of the biggest concerns, which is that one single entity, namely Meta, will be able to surveil and monitor everything happening inside. And if it wants that to be a reality, or basically what we're doing now, but we're doing that there, that suppresses many other of our rights, like not only privacy, we're talking about intimacy. You make me with your lover in some kind of room in the metaverse, and Facebook would know about that. Whereas before, maybe it wouldn't have access to that, maybe it would have access to your chats and of course everything, but it would not be as present as in the metaverse. So there's like many things to fear about that. Second thing that I fear is the robustness of the technologies that will be employed in the metaverse. I'm afraid that right now we're trying to implement technologies that are not as advanced as we want them to be, but we just want to implement that because that's how we do it. The third thing that I'm concerned is cybersecurity. Who controls who can enter the metaverse, who can access to that? How can we be sure that we will not be speaking about, I don't know, like cyber terrorism in the metaverse? Like maybe the next big terrorist attack will not be in one of our cities, unfortunately, but would be like a shock that will stop the metaverse from functioning, and we will be like so shocked of falling out of that metaverse that we will be like, you know, like unconscious for a while, or maybe one of us could have a heart attack. But imagine that on a larger scale. So I think we need to rethink what the metaverse is going to be for us, and certainly we need to not regulate that in advance, but at least try to foresee the potential impacts and try to mitigate them. So I think that's a huge topic, Jack. That's the thing.
You've terrified me now as well.
I tend to be a
cyber terrorist attack in the metaverse that's going to give me a heart attack. I'm having a heart attack now thinking about it. Andreas, I know you raised your hand and you wanted to come in and say something on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the metaverse is a huge topic. I wouldn't like to focus too much on the metaverse, but I want to say that, if you look 17 years back or 15, if that's easy, take the time machine, and go back around the time when Facebook was introduced, it was a phenomenon, right? President Obama at the time based most of his electoral campaign on Facebook, and most commentators said that, this is this social media platform or social media platforms that will come haven't come any after that, would allow and enable people, to exchange opinions and deliberate about politics in a way that was until previously unthought of. And I mean, 15 years later, we now know all the problems about this platform. But when we started, there was this positive outlook. And what I want to say about metaverse is that, I think the big challenge would be, and this is where the Meta team will have to work hard, is to make sure that the lessons that they have taken from Facebook and its social impact will now be addressed in Meta. There is no way, that anybody would think this a legitimate excuse that the lessons have not been adopted.
Yeah, we veered off there a little bit. That was my fault. You were right to bring us back in there, Andreas, because it is such a huge topic, and these are the things that are really kind of affecting people, I think. Martina, I wonder if we can talk about this. We'll revert a bit back to AI. About maybe you can talk about trust, and do we trust either the big tech companies or the governments to control it? As we've been talking about, there's this sort of idea that with all of the sort of tech innovations, the policy always comes afterwards. Like the huge explosion happens, and then we have to deal with it from a policy perspective in the EU and everywhere in the world. Do you think we're ready, and do you think citizens trust politicians to do this properly?
Luckily enough, we don't have only trust. In the sense, we do not have only trust as consumers, as I don't know, undertakings that are active in the digital economy, that we can rely on vis-a-vis the big techs or other actors in the digital economy, or even public authorities. There is, let's say, already today, even while we are discussing possible possible regulation, regulatory proposals. There is a lot of, let's say, legal provisions which are already there. The problem of the digital economy is that we do not know how to apply the laws which relate to the old world to the new world, because we must ask ourselves to what an extent the legal rules and principles which regulated the economy before the digitalization apply to in this mutated context, and to what an extent we need new rules. Obviously, there is the perception that we definitely need new rules, and there is, let's say, a lot of activity of the Commission in this respect. So I would say that in the digital economy, because I'm mainly, let's say, an expert of economic law, trust is important, but likely it is not everything.
Yeah, policy needs to be strong. Lewin, yeah, please.
May I come in this? I fully agree with what my colleague said, and I think the underlying question, whether it's the metaverse, the question of trust, is really sort of, when we talk about these digital transformations, where do we as a society, as citizens want to be? Do we want to be in the driving seat and steer the development, or do we want to have it happen to us, as Andrea said, to have companies create the necessity for a certain product? And I think here it's very interesting. I mean, we've been talking about the EU a lot in this session and its capability to regulate. And I think that's crucial at this scale, that we come together as sort of smaller countries, because when you deal with Facebook, it's better to join forces. But I think in light of today's session also, it's really important that we go to the local level. And I think here the Catalan government, the City Council of Barcelona are good examples of a handful of cities that really have conversations around the use of tech in their daily life, but also that sort of think about how this can be governed from a sort of more bottom-up approach. And I think, yeah, that's really important to have both sides coming together and playing together when we really want to be in the driving seat.
You know what, there's a question that's come in on the chat that's kind of related to this, and I'm going to stay with you, Lewin, on it. This is from Arno G. Thank you so much for joining us. And just to remind everyone to keep putting your questions into the comments on the YouTube feed. They'll be sent over to me and we can put them to our panelists. His question is, how is AI actually going to affect us as citizens? He's asking to elaborate more on that. Where is AI going to come into our lives? At what sort of junctions do we encounter AI in our lives? Lewin? Oh, Andrea wants to talk. Andrea's got a hand up. Go for it, Andrea.
I'm sorry, I was like trying to use all this tools that Zoom has.
You used your real hand instead.
I know. I'm you know what? It's already too late. It's the third talk, so so I'm just like trying to be I don't know, as ordered as possible. So I think that when we speak about the impact on AI in our lives, we should start thinking from the narrowest definition of it possible. When we open our inbox, there is an AI there managing our inbox, saying what messages should go to spam, which other ones should make it to our priority inbox, and which one should not make it there, because they're like, you know what, like maybe it's the newsletter you signed up for 2 years ago and that you never opened. And the AI learns that, and therefore it's not really spam, but it's there. And just in case you want to open that, it's not going to make it a priority. So I think that we are seeing AI already govern many of our like daily lives. Like not only that, for example, we can also like think of greater things that AI is starting to have a presence on, namely, for example, in the fight against climate change. We've just had a deal on the COP26, and part of those deals are based on models, on AI models. They're trying to predict, let's say, what the world would look like if we keep doing that, or if we stop doing something, right? You can adjust those weights, and then you can see the correlations, and you can see the outputs. So I think it's a very interesting tool, but also from a security perspective, it's also worrisome to see how AI is playing out. I'm thinking, for example, of predictive policy. predictive policing, right? So what we're having like lots of data that we correlate them, we use them, and then we take predictions. And in most of the times, or like no, most of the times, this data is biased. So I'm thinking, for example, in the US, there's a case study that has been largely discussed and largely studied is the case study of Compass. So this software is used in courts in the US, and it's about recidivism, meaning if someone is going to commit the same crime again if that person is released. And based on what the algorithm said, the judges takes one or other, let's say, decision. And this particular software has been found to be very discriminatory against African-American population, because the data it is fed with tends to overrepresent African-Americans, and therefore the outputs tend to be like more discriminatory and just point at African-American people, meaning that someone who's like white Caucasian will have probably like a less years in prison than someone who's African-American. And this is Compass, but we're having other questions. So I think that that's how AI is like getting into our lives, from the narrowest and tiniest things, such as like managing our inbox, to something that affects us directly in our rights as citizens, and what is like what is the biggest right as having a fair trial, right? Then other things that such as like trying to help us foresee the better policies to ensure the future of humanity. In that sense, where we're speaking, for example, about climate change. So that is the impact. Or I don't know if you want to add something else to the table, but that's why I think that there's like so many things we have to deal with regulation, because the impact of this technology is it's so big that we really need to make it right.
Andreas.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that, you know, we may have now tabled a regulation about AI rules in the EU, but it's not like we have AI anywhere apart from the things that Andrea already mentioned. So, you know, very elementary. And maybe, you know, in order to be able to see the added value that AI innovation can bring, we will need to also wait a few years to see that the data infrastructure and the regulations we have, you know, we are discussing, will actually allow companies to be able to innovate and to create groundbreaking things. So apart from the things that Andrea mentioned right now, it is, you know, very much in areas that ordinary citizens like us, we don't experience. So military and defense is a huge area, and secret services surveillance is also another huge area where AI, we don't know if it is used, but we can be certain that it is used. So I think, you know, in a way, I think at this point, when we discuss AI, we get locked sometimes between the question about values and the question about innovation. And very often the private sector likes to say that if you get too much focused on values and protections of data, then it will be hard for companies, and especially the small companies, to innovate and grow. But, you know, I think maybe this is a problematic way of positioning things, because it is indeed the case that you want to increase innovation and help small companies grow larger. But the reason why they're not growing larger is not because there is no way for them to develop AI. It's because we are at a much earlier stage to discuss AI, even because we haven't finalized many things about you know, what we used to call the digital single market. It was about you know, a place where you can have data exchanges and you can have small companies to use data and design better products, but also companies where you know, they can access their consumer base and where trade barriers are lowered in the single market. But we're not there yet. And in fact, you know, the European Parliament has published previously a report, I think, from the IMCO committee about you know, the trade barriers in the digital single market. And if we want to see AI thriving in the EU and the EU becoming a major actor in designing AI, not just checking if it is, you know, if it's compatible with our values, right? This is one thing that's easy to talk about. How can AI be compatible with our values? But first, we need to develop it. And if, you know, we can have AI facilitating trade and commerce across the EU, then there will be also a very strong interest from the private sector to innovate in this.
It's the balance, and it's going to be the fight of our times. Lewin, just quickly, we want to move on. I want to talk about data, and I'm acutely aware that actually we might not have that much time. But you were talking about these sort of killer robot things that are, you know, should we be terrified? Basically, what are they, and how do we? I mean, they are completely outlawed in the AI Act, right, of the EU so far. But is that enough?
No, that's the problem. And Andreas also just mentioned it. And I thought I mentioned it also in my introduction. The AI Act does not deal with military applications at all. So the European Union does not actively fund killer robots because that's prohibited in the EDF, the European Defense Fund. But member states in Europe and across the world can still do what they want. And they are, as a matter of fact, developing these kind of weapons that will then sort of killer robots that will autonomously engage with their targets and even potentially kill people. And yeah, I mean, that's again a question for society. Do we want a future world where this scenario is on the table? And I think that's also something I wanted to mention, where again, I believe the role of cities or regional governments can be very crucial, because we've seen in the forthcoming research that I mentioned before, that the European Union does not manage to get a common voice on this, because there's different interests by national governments who are often captured by sort of old ideas about national security, but also they have close links to the defense industries, etc. So I think that's also a gap where maybe the subnational level and civil society, together with city governments, etc., could sort of bring in their voices and say, no, we don't actually want killer robots developed in Europe.
Certainly don't. Andreas, I can see you want to add something.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the geopolitics, right? Because we're talking about AI and we're saying, we don't want to have as Lewin said, security is a national capacity. It's a national competence. So, we might ban AI from the EU level in defense, but member states can do what they like and their secret services. But, I think we ought to open up a little bit and come, back and see, the whole picture. And, I was mentioning earlier this bad scenario where the EU is locked in a G2 world between the US and China. And there, we know for a fact that Russia, the Russian Federation and China are working together on military or, AI for defense and military purposes. And we know that the US is probably doing the same. So, my question here, and, to provoke a little bit of discussion is, do we want to have, China developing AI for military purpose and defense, and we just say we don't want this to happen? I think, sometimes, we might have to do things in order to make sure that the ones that we don't trust that do them are not the only ones that can actually, have a stake in this game.
I'm gonna bring in this issue of the US and China a little bit later on, but you've prodded a good question, and you're certainly right. But I want to move on to data a little bit, actually, and bring you, Martina, back in. We've had another question from Daniel Florenza, who wants to say on data, to what extent do you think the big data market is compatible with respecting privacy rights, such as consent and contractual resolution? And I think that's something that you're going to be able to talk about.
Definitely. So I am no, let's say, big expert in the general data protection regulation, but certainly when we talk about even businesses sharing data, so pooling or sharing data, that is something that the Commission is desperately trying to promote. Well, even in that case, we do not need to think that because it is business data, like personal data is not included. Personal data is ubiquitous. And actually, this is one of the main issues, if you want, for the data economy. So for establishing, let's say, pools of data that we can use to train, for example, and to feed data-hungry technologies such as artificial intelligence. So it will be very hard to disentangle the data sets which are not relevant for the purpose of the general data protection regulation with those that are relevant. So like even in the context of manufacturing data, for example, so it would be important. So if we have data which are produced from a smart manufacturing machine, well, those data, this data, sorry, could tell us something about the person working to to operate this machine. And since it is data that relate to the activity of the employee, then it's personal data. And so, like, as you see, even in the most trivial cases, you have, let's say, data sets which are mixed, personal and non-personal data. How will it be possible to create a genuine data economy with this level of ubiquity of personal data? Well, this is very hard. This is very hard to say. But in general, I have to say that this is a very significant issue for experts of personal data protection and for everybody in general. The only thing I can add is that actually the Commission has proposed in the Data Governance Act those actors which are called data intermediaries, through which even natural persons can put their data to use. So in that case, through the data intermediary, there could be basically a secondary market even for data which relate to individuals, according to what I read. Then, of course, it's a proposal, so we always have to see how it ends up. But this is an idea that the Commission is trying to promote.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see where that goes as well. Andrea, to bring you in, so I would perhaps suggest that since the sort of breakout of social media, etc., we have sort of, as a society, willingly handed our data over without much thought, and it's only in sort of retrospect that we're seeing how it is used. Do you think citizens care? Do you think we've gone so far? I mean, how much do citizens care about their personal data? Obviously we would, but we have handed it over quite freely, no?
I think that the fact that companies such as Apple are selling privacy as a service tells us a lot about the status of privacy right now. I think that we care, but we don't care enough. And if we cared, we would have like probably privacy embedded into every application, because we would demand that from the companies. Either you're making something that respects my privacy, or I'm not buying that on the market. But right now, privacy is it's something that helps us differentiate between different products. If you want privacy, buy an iPhone, but an iPhone can be, I don't know, like 60% more expensive than a Chinese phone. If I'm taking into account, for example, like a Xiaomi phone in the latest iPhone 13. So I think that we are getting there, and there's like also other indicatives that are like making me a little bit more optimistic about the topic, which is the amount of books that have been written about privacy and in terms of like popular science books. I'm thinking, for instance, about Carissa Vélez, Privacy's Power, that it's like selling lots and lots of books everywhere, and that was, by the way, it was like first released in English in London by Penguin Books, and then it was like translated into many other languages. So I think that we are starting to care, but we are not caring enough. And you can see that also in the institutions. So that the institutions have started caring about like privacy a little bit before GDPR, and now that GDPR is on, we believe that that's everything that we can do, and that privacy in the GDPR is perfect, and therefore we should move on with our lives. And I think that the general status is that there's like something happening, and we're just like starting to become aware of what the lack of privacy can take us to.
It's such a complicated issue now. Listen, so Gorka from the representation of Catalonia here in the EU has dropped a question in, which I think leads us quite nicely onto a conversation that we probably should move on to. And something I suggested as well about infrastructure and connectivity. His question is, will the EU be able to build the digital technology infrastructure without becoming dependent on the US and China? We've seen, for instance, Huawei, the Chinese, are sort of heavily involved in the rollout of 5G, and they sort of put forward their very slick 5G masks that are sort of less, probably aesthetically a little bit more pleasing than some of the other ones in Europe, etc. Lewin, I don't know where you think about that. Can Europe build our own infrastructure? And if we need to import it in, can we hold on to some of our independence in this?
Well, I think 2 or 3 years ago, when still in Brussels, we were all ringing the alarm precisely because of the topics that you just mentioned. And I think it was good that Europe sort of had this wake-up moment and really reckoning as to how dependent we are in certain areas. But I think also a fair assessment requires more nuance. And for example, if you see how dependent even China is when it comes to production of microchip equipment, which, for example, European players are actually world leaders, you see that the value chain, the supply chain is so long and complicated that really, in reality, often we have mutual dependencies, which mean that in the end, because everyone's depending on everyone, no one is really dependent. So I think the picture is not as gloomy as we painted it back then to wake people up. But of course, we do need to step up our investment. And I think we need to be very careful in terms of cybersecurity, what kind of also CCTV cameras we let onto the European market. So there was just a report last month about security flaws in Chinese camera systems, which are being used by the London police, inter alia, but also across Europe. And I think that's very critical. If you have a scenario where your digital infrastructure really depends on Chinese software and hardware, that's something you don't want to have, obviously. So yeah, we need to have sort of a measured approach. I don't think we all lost. I'm sure my colleagues also have other points to introduce why we should be concerned. But yeah, I do have some hope for Europe.
Well, yeah, not too negative from you. Andreas, where do you think, how can we build our own independence? Interesting as well that you mentioned the sort of semiconductors issue as well, Lewin. That's something that's going to be a huge issue. But the question to you, Andreas, is how can we make sure we're independent of the G2 that you keep on dropping on us?
Thanks, Jack. Well, you know, what I am worried about is that in the Commission's 2030 Digital Compass, so the plans of the Commission for 2030, they envisage 75% of EU businesses having taken up some sort of AI by 2030. And this currently seems very unlikely that it could happen. So, you know, the thing is, we are making plans and we're planning ahead about what development should look like in the EU and what digitalization should look like. And while we make these plans, at the same time, we want to make sure that you know, we have our fundamental rights protected. And that's, of course, very important because I think around 80% of EU citizens agree that transparency in AI and AI applications is key. So, but I think it's hard to you know, both you know, make plans for the future and at the same time raise barriers. And what I'm saying, raise barriers, not that anybody has suggested to raise barriers. I think we need to be careful because, you know, the debate on digital sovereignty is also a debate that can be seen sometimes ideological, because as I was saying earlier in my input, you know, 10 years ago, the dependencies that we have on the US, we were seeing when we're discussing in the spirit of cooperation, and perhaps, you know, the EU will build its own competencies there and there. So, you know, now where we are, it is quite, you know, it's a bit concerning when we are thinking, you know, we want to achieve all these things by 2030, but at the same time, we don't have anything to do with China, and we don't want to be dependent on the US. Well, you know, I personally don't think that it's possible to achieve any of these goals if we don't cooperate. And we need to sort of, you know, think of not about dependency, but more about cooperation again. And you know, there are some new forums that are created that can boost that cooperation. And with the Chinese, we think we can work very closely on green. and achieving the green targets, which are agreed among everybody at COP26, right? But with the US, we have joint plans about how to create technology standards that will be compatible with the democracies that the EU and the US are. So I think this is the kind of spirit that we need to position this discussion of sovereignty, you know, not to overstress the issue of sovereignty, because I think it is a bit of a Don Quixotical concept at this point.
Interesting. So I'm going to bring in a question from the chat as well. I'll bring you in, Martina, on this. This is from Eduard Falco. It's kind of relevant, actually. What he's suggesting is the question is: we seem to cede rights to technology. We're losing sovereignty versus technology, and this can lead to major conflicts. The normal citizen is comfortable like that. Don't you think the EU should act on it? But how? This is I think the suggestion there is our own sort of sovereignty versus the sovereignty of our digital nature as the European Union. How do those things connect, the sort of personal to the broad political, Martina?
I think that we have the impression that there is a clash between sovereignty and technology, especially because the big techs are generally foreign market players. So we have a hard time getting a grip on them because they are exposed to foreign authorities. Their main seat is elsewhere. And if there is, we have to deal with, let's say, a big company whose headquarters is in the US, it is likely to imagine that it won't resist let's say, an initiative of the American public authorities to, for example, access data that it is storing on its servers. So the whole problem is precisely that we have the sensation in the European Union that this is a problem, because not only because our companies, let's say, their sensitive data are stored in servers, in data centers, which are basically accessible to foreign authorities. Let's think about what happened with the US Cloud Act, which enabled the American authority to the American judiciary to access that data stored worldwide. But it is also a problem because basically we find ourselves reliant on foreign providers of services, even for activities which have a significant public and social relevance. So the very operativeness of our financial systems and of our health systems could depend upon the provision of services by foreign authorities. And this is felt as something, let's say, disturbing. So I think that this is objectively an issue that is generated, as Andreas was saying, by interdependence, because in a world which is open, in open economies, there is some level of interdependence. But in this case, we are a bit maybe too dependent, or at least this is what is in the air in the European Union.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's this constant sense of discomfort sometimes regarding those companies that are in control. So let's move on, just because we're sort of nearing towards already the end. We've got just over 15 minutes left. Let's talk a bit about this issue of semiconductors and microchips. This is a huge concern for the EU, to the point where they're sort of putting together a microchip alliance to try and get everybody to be working together. I know this is something that you have some expertise on, Andrea. Perhaps you can explain what's going on at the moment with this shortage and what it could mean for us in Europe.
I think this conversation has been very interesting for me because I haven't contributed that much from the perspective of strategic autonomy, which is something that I
feel free to. Sorry, I didn't realize.
No, completely. I was like there just stopping out, like didn't want to interrupt the conversation because that's something so familiar to me that always looking and listening to new insights is more than welcome, like being taught instead of like going and delivering the speech that I normally do to the people working around me every day at CETC. So, but just to contribute on this angle, we need to take into account that what the EU right now is trying to pursue is this strategy of what the EU calls an open strategic autonomy, meaning like trying to focus on our things whenever we can and just collaborating with other actors whenever we must. And this two different parts of the strategic vision of the EU right now, like trying to deliver our own capacity, but being also aware that we cannot deliver every capacity and that we cannot be autonomous in everything. And therefore we select the rest of the allies because we must cooperate with them, is what leads us to the issue of semiconductors. So we've seen that since the 5G issue with Huawei, digital supply chains have been to say the least distorted and to say the major disrupted. And the pandemic has had lots of things to do with that, because all of a sudden we stopped asking for the things that we were like asking. So the market was disrupted completely, and then we all of a sudden we all needed to buy those things. So with this supply chains or whatever, like not on the best shape, and all the efforts that we have been trying to do for the last years, and plus all the demand already like suddenly reactivated, we have found ourselves in a moment of semiconductor shortage. And the problem is that semiconductors are basic for absolutely everything on the digital market, like not only like to create AI, but also for computers, for cars, for smart grids, and so on and so forth. And to be able to have like this basic instruments, we need to be able to have some capacity. And as of now, most of the capacity it's in Taiwan, but also in other countries. And none of us is European, although we have like some players in the semiconductor industry, such as a Dutch firm that provides the machines. But we need to relocate some of these processes or parts of critical processes within the supply chain in Europe in order to be able to ensure what Breton has called the security of supply. So if we need that, let's say in a moment when supply chains are completely distorted, but of course we need our economy to keep functioning, we need to be able to produce at home, manufacture chips at home, and that's something that we are not having. We don't have enough fabs in Europe to be able to ensure like some leverage. And even though we're having like some companies such as Intel wanting to open these fabs in Europe, it's not enough. So in the State of the Union speech, von der Leyen said that it would be releasing a new European Chips Act that would want to on the first hand to make, and this was already like mentioned in the Digital Compass at the beginning of the year, that 20% of the global semiconductor industry will be produced in Europe. And right now, what we have is less than 10%. And ideally, with the US, we should have like EU plus US 50% of the semiconductor market. And that means that rethinking many of the things. And as Lewin was saying here in the speakers chat that we have, I wrote like recently a small piece discussing this topic. And I think that in order for this act to be successful, in order to like not for the act, but for the strategic vision of the EU to be able to be realized by 2030, which is the date that we want the first target to be accomplished, we will need, like, first of all, digital partnerships with key allies such as South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. We need to ensure that we cooperate with them so we can just like work with them more now. That would mean like obviously offering other type of concessions, and we're seeing that like that approachment or reapproachment to Taiwan with the visit of an EU delegation to the island of Formosa, like not that long ago. So that means like lots of diplomatic leverage, but also like not only like digital partnerships, but so on, like control like national interest here at home, and certainly like be real about our targets and knowing that we don't have the capacity to reach them unless we work really hard.
That visit was pretty controversial as well, though, and caused some issues with China as well, though, right? And that just shows the sort of international issue of this. So what Andrea was talking about there, Lewin, was this idea that we need to create this press from the European Union that we're going to need to look after our own and build our own chips and get to 20%, etc. You were mentioning sort of regionalization, that Catalonia, for instance, is a place where there's this sort of burgeoning, tech platform. Is this what's going to happen? Are we going to start having chip factories in, on the outskirts of Barcelona, or is that how it needs to happen? The regional governments need to get involved in this.
I'm not sure where it's going to happen. I think to some extent we will see developments. I think regional governments should play a role in this, but more generally speaking, we've mentioned a few of these alliances, industry alliance, the semiconductor alliance, we have an AI alliance, and I think what we are seeing is that these alliances can be very effective on sort of more simple topics. So the battery alliance seems to be going well, but we also see it failing. That's hopefully not too strong a word, but for example, for the Gaia X project, where they're trying to generate this European cloud infrastructure, and apparently it's not going so well because it's just such a complex topic. Where I think this sort of multi-stakeholder approach, bringing everyone at the same table, maybe it's not the best way. Maybe you need to have competition and different solutions, and then the best one will actually sort of work itself through. So I think when it comes to semiconductors and your question, Europe also has to be careful that we don't get lost in sort of these very big alliances and trying to make everyone happy. But maybe what we need is sort of an enabler for sort of a more competitive ecosystem, for innovation to occur, for capacity to be built up, etc.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, because I think as well at the moment the semiconductor shortage isn't necessarily it's having a big effect on the industries, but it's not like having an effect in our everyday life yet. But then if things start crashing,
well, if you bought an electric car, you would probably have an effect, because the waiting times apparently now for, I don't know, new electric vehicles is quite long because they're waiting on.
Is it really? I actually looked at buying an electric car recently. Even the cheapest ones are so expensive at the moment for the new ones, and that's a whole nother issue. We need a whole nother session to start talking about green transitions as well. Andreas, I wonder, so we talked there about Taiwan, for instance, and the issues around there. And I know that you look at these things from a sort of international perspective as well. How can these things be resolved? What should we be doing? How should the EU be thinking about all of these issues like semiconductors, to make sure that they don't cause sideline issues and sort of foreign policy concerns?
Yeah, that's a really big question for me, but I'm sure that my colleagues will happy to chip in where my master plan is not well developed. But okay, so I think everybody has mentioned here that the industry of semiconductors is basically all around the place. You have the biggest factory for producing semiconductors in Taiwan, which is in the disputed island of Taiwan, and the EU is at the same time competing with China, and China has a claim to Taiwan. So this is a really, really complicated situation to be in. At the same time, though, it's not just where you make the semiconductors or which factory has the capacity to produce such cutting-edge semiconductors. We're talking here about semiconductors that you can use in the automotive industry and others that you can use in really, really small devices. So when it comes to the semiconductors that are for the automotive industry, and because you have more space in a car than on your hand where you can keep your phone, here the EU is not doing so badly. But we are having shortages when it comes to semiconductors for cutting edge industries, so iPhones and things like that, really small devices. But, we know that the Americans have been very good at designing semiconductors for many years, and they have been outsourcing production. And that's the reason why now they have a very low market share in the production of those semiconductors. At the same time, lots of the raw materials and critical resources for producing these semiconductors, you have lots of these in Africa. And you know, Africa is a place where China has had a very, very good and successful relationships because of its Belt and Road Initiative. And the Belt and Road Initiative is, you know, something that brings different countries together to advance certain priorities and also benefit at the same time. So, you know, at the same, but
EU has put together their own version of this, though. Von der Leyen announced that in that State of the Union speech in September, right? That the EU wants to have some sort of infrastructure thing. How important? I mean, on digital issues. I mean, digital infrastructure connectivity with Africa as well, and you know, other parts of the developing world would probably be important, right?
Yeah, of course, that's hugely important. And I mean, we can't start to stress how late we are on doing this, you know. But it's all about the money and how can you channel the money in the most productive way possible. Other actors are much better at that. And I don't mean to speak for too long, but yeah, the Chinese, for example, they're able to directly subsidize their companies. We cannot do this in the EU because we have a level playing field in the single market. So it's hard to even start. But, you know, there's definitely ways out there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's you know, we're in a really interesting moment where we're switching. There's just, I always do this at the end of the event. We've got 5 minutes left. Is there anything anybody wants to just raise? I've got more questions of what I'll ask. But is there anything anyone wants to sort of touch on that they will, if they don't say today, now, they'll be annoyed with themselves later on? I always ask everyone, if you want to say something or bring up a particular topic that we haven't touched on, feel free to unmute your mic and jump in there. No, everyone. Oh yeah, Andreas, go on.
Yeah, I just want to go back, you know, and question again this question about sovereignty. And we don't feel well when we are aware that we are dependent, right? Everybody hates that. But I think we need to get used that the digital transformation cannot be made in the EU only. And we need to open up our you know, perspectives about how we approach this and not to become ideological, because the time is ticking, the clock is ticking, and others are doing already better than us. And I'm not saying that, you know, we're not going to do better, but in order to be, you know, we might not even be able to be locked in a G2 world if we don't do what we need to do. This is a bit gloomy, I'm sorry.
We've got to accept dependence and just do as we're told by America and China, Andreas.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
I'm only joking. I'm joking. So Martino, I'll bring you in just finally. I mean, do you think the EU has the power and the political will among member states to tackle these issues? That's a broad question, I know, but do you think it's going to be okay?
The problem is what we are, let's say, ready to sacrifice for that, of course. So in the context of the European Union, we have always liked to keep our market open. So this is a long-standing tradition of the European Union. And member states are also compelled to comply with the WTO, regime, with the legal regime of the World Trade Organization. So there are, let's say, legal constraints to excluding foreign players because they are foreign players. And it is, but an interesting example of how hard it is to propose European alternatives was mentioned by Levin, who talked about Gaia X, was supposed as to be a way for the European industry to, let's say, get together and to provide a cloud infrastructure, federated cloud infrastructure. And now, if you have a look at the members, there's also the big techs, because of course they simply applied, and so they are part of this cloud federation. So it is not hard to, let's say, keep your market open and to, let's say, bring forward this digital sovereignty that everybody is talking about.
Yeah, Lewin, just quick, you got your hand raised, so I'll let you have a comment just before we wrap the session up. We're running out of time. I can see you wanted to say something.
Great. Well, it relates to what Martina just said about the market structure, and I think that's very important and something that I wanted to answer to you about an aspect we haven't brought in yet that's critical. And I think that's the role of competition policy. And just this week or last week, the European Commission won again a major case against Google about $1 billion fine because Google has used anti-competitive measures. And that also brings me back to an earlier question. If people care about privacy, why don't they go away from Facebook, right? I think we have to understand really that digital markets and platforms don't work in the same way that, I don't know, your local shoe shop does. You don't have the same choice, because if everyone is on Facebook, there's no, well, it doesn't really work that you just leave Facebook and you can still communicate. So I think that's again also an area where the European Union has been at the forefront globally to sort of update its competition rules, have these really strong rulings against the GAFAs. And I think that's a good avenue for further action as well. And that makes me also hopeful that not all is lost on technology.
Ah, there we go. That's a nice way to wrap up this session. Listen, for me, this has been absolutely fascinating. There are so many things that we haven't been able to talk about, but obviously this is a massive issue. But I do think we've sort of, I hope you'll agree, broadly covered our title, which is sort of Europe's digital challenges. And I think we've looked at many different aspects. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Lewin Schmidt, to Martina, to Andreas, and to Andrea for joining us from your respective locations. It's been a really great chat. Thank you to everybody who has dropped in the questions that we've managed to get to a few of them. Thank you so much to the government of Catalonia for hosting this event. And I just encourage everybody who has been watching to go to our speakers who are real experts in this field, find them online and give them a follow. So I wish you all a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for being with us, guys.